She was just another airline captain flying routine passengers, until both engines exploded at 37,000 feet. 200 souls. Zero power. 15 minutes to live. But what nobody knew was that she'd flown F/A-18 Super Hornets in combat. Her hidden military past was about to save them all. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was January 15, 2024, Monday morning. Captain Maya Richardson checked her watch as she walked through the employee entrance of Denver International Airport. It was 5:47 a.m., and the winter sky was still dark. She carried her small rolling suitcase and flight bag, looking like any other airline pilot starting another ordinary workday. Her uniform was pressed, her hair pulled back neatly, and her face showed the calm confidence of someone who had flown this route dozens of times before. Maya was 34 years old and had been flying commercial aircraft for 6 years. Before that, she had spent 8 years in the Navy, but she rarely talked about those days. Her airline colleagues knew she was former military, it was mentioned briefly in her personnel file, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know that she had flown F/A-18 Super Hornets, one of the most advanced combat aircraft in the world. They didn't know about the carrier landings in rough seas, the combat missions over hostile territory, or the emergency situations that had tested her skills in ways civilian flying never would. She preferred it that way. Commercial aviation was peaceful, predictable, and safe. She flew passengers from one city to another, following established routes and procedures. There was no enemy fire, no emergency ejections, no life-or-death decisions made in split seconds while pulling high G-forces. She had left that world behind, and she was content to be just another airline captain doing her job professionally and quietly. Today's flight was Transcontinental Airlines Flight 2847, a Boeing 777 flying from Denver to Boston. It was a route Maya had flown many times. The flight would take approximately 4 hours, cruising at 37,000 feet over the Midwest and Northeast. Weather was good, with clear skies expected most of the way. It should be routine. In the crew briefing room, Maya met her first officer for the day, Jason Chen. He was 28, enthusiastic, and had been with the airline for 3 years. This was his second time flying with Maya, and he respected her calm professionalism. "Morning, Captain," Jason said, looking up from his tablet where he was reviewing the flight plan. "Good morning, Jason. How's everything looking?" "Pretty standard. We've got 197 passengers booked, light cargo load, and weather's cooperating. Maintenance signed off on everything last night, no issues with the aircraft." Maya nodded, sitting down to review the paperwork herself. The Boeing 777 they'd be flying today was relatively new, only 5 years old, with an excellent maintenance record. Both engines were Pratt & Whitney turbofans, powerful and reliable. The aircraft had been inspected just 3 days ago, and everything was perfect. They went through the standard briefing, discussing the route, alternate airports, fuel requirements, and emergency procedures. Jason was thorough but relaxed. Dual-engine failure wasn't something they spent much time on because it was extraordinarily rare in modern commercial aviation. Both pilots had practiced it in the simulator, of course, but actually experiencing it in real life was almost unheard of. The chances were millions to one. By 7:15 a.m., Maya and Jason were in the cockpit running through pre-flight checks. The early morning light was just beginning to break over the eastern horizon. The cockpit was quiet except for the soft beeping of instruments and the occasional radio communication from ground control. Everything felt normal, routine, exactly as it should be. Down in the passenger cabin, 197 people were settling into their seats. There were business travelers heading to meetings in Boston, families visiting relatives, college students returning to school after winter break, and tourists starting vacations. They barely noticed the captain's voice when it came over the intercom, calm, professional, female. "Good morning, everyone. This is Captain Richardson speaking. Welcome aboard Transcontinental Flight 2847 to Boston. We're expecting a smooth flight today with a flight time of approximately 4 hours and 10 minutes. Weather in Boston is currently clear and cold, about 28 degrees. We'll be cruising at 37,000 feet, and you should be able to sit back and relax. Our flight attendants will be coming through the cabin shortly after takeoff. Thank you for choosing Transcontinental Airlines. The passengers didn't think much about who was flying the plane. They trusted that whoever was up front knew what they were doing. That trust was well placed, though none of them could have known just how well placed it was. Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate at 7:42 a.m., right on schedule. Maya taxied the massive aircraft toward the runway, following ground control's instructions. The Boeing 777 was a beautiful machine to fly, smooth, powerful, and responsive. She had logged over 3,000 hours in this type of aircraft and knew its systems intimately. At 7:51 a.m., they were cleared for takeoff on runway 34R. Maya advanced the throttles, and the two massive engines spooled up to full power. The acceleration was smooth and strong. The nose lifted at exactly the right speed, and they climbed into the clear Colorado morning sky. Positive rate, gear up, Maya said calmly. Gear up, Jason confirmed, raising the landing gear lever. The flight climbed steadily, passing through 10,000 feet, then 20,000, then 30,000. Air traffic control handed them off from one sector to another as they crossed from Colorado into Kansas. The sun was fully up now, and below them, the landscape looked like a patchwork quilt of brown and white, winter fields and scattered snow. By 9:20 a.m., they had reached their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet and were flying east over Missouri. The autopilot was engaged, and the flight was proceeding exactly as planned. Jason was monitoring the fuel flow and navigation systems while Maya kept an eye on overall aircraft performance. In the cabin behind them, passengers were reading, working on laptops, watching movies, or dozing. The flight attendants had finished the beverage service and were relaxing in their jump seats. It was at 9:23 a.m. that everything changed. Maya heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a deep, rattling bang from somewhere behind them, followed immediately by warning lights illuminating on her instrument panel. Her eyes snapped to the engine instruments, and what she saw confirmed her worst fear. The left engine's oil pressure had dropped to 0. Temperature was spiking. RPM was falling rapidly. Left engine failure, she announced, her voice completely calm despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. Jason's head whipped around to look at the instruments. Confirmed. Left engine. He didn't finish the sentence because at that exact moment, a second bang shook the aircraft, and the right engine's instruments began showing identical failures. Right engine failure. Jason's voice had risen in pitch. Both engines. Maya's hands were already moving. This was the nightmare scenario, dual engine failure at 37,000 feet with 197 passengers on board. But while Jason's training told him this was a catastrophic emergency, Maya's deeper training, the training that came from years flying F/A-18 Super Hornets, told her something different. It told her this was manageable if she stayed calm and flew the aircraft with precision. In her 8 years flying combat aircraft off carriers, Maya had experienced 3 actual engine failures. One had occurred during a combat mission over the Indian Ocean when a compressor blade failure had shut down her left engine at 25,000 feet. Another had happened during a training exercise when a bird strike had destroyed her right engine on final approach to the carrier. The third had been the terrifying moment when both engines had flamed out during a high-altitude intercept mission due to fuel system contamination, and she'd had to relight them while falling through thin air. Commercial pilots spent their entire careers hoping to never experience even one engine failure. Maya had survived 3, and she'd survived them because her combat training had taught her to think tactically, manage energy like a precious resource, and never, ever panic. "I have the aircraft," Maya said firmly, disengaging the autopilot and taking manual control. "You have the aircraft," Jason confirmed, his hands trembling slightly. The Boeing 777 was now a glider, 200 tons of metal, fuel, passengers, and cargo with no thrust, falling through the sky at 37,000 feet. Without engines, they had no hydraulic power for the flight controls except what the backup systems could provide. They had no electrical power except what the batteries and ram air turbine could generate. They had perhaps 15 to 20 minutes before they'd hit the ground. Maya's mind was calculating possibilities with the speed and precision that carrier landings had taught her. At 37,000 feet with no engines, she could glide approximately 100 miles in still air, maybe less depending on winds and how well she managed the aircraft's energy. She needed to find an airport within that range, and she needed to find it now. Jason, I need you to pull up the nearest suitable airports. Look for long runways, Class B or Class C airports preferred. Check within a 100-mile radius of our current position. Jason's fingers were clumsy on the computer keyboard, but he managed to bring up the navigation display. Lambert International in St. Louis is 73 miles ahead, bearing 095 degrees. Runway November 29th is 11,000 feet long. That's our target. Declare an emergency with Kansas City Center. Tell them we've lost both engines and we're diverting to Lambert. While Jason made the radio call, Maya was already turning the aircraft toward St. Louis. But she wasn't turning like a normal commercial pilot would turn, she was managing the turn with the precision of a combat aviator who understood that every degree of bank angle, every foot of altitude, and every knot of airspeed was now a resource she couldn't waste. In an F/18, when you lost engine power, you flew the aircraft at its best glide speed, the speed that gave you the maximum distance over the ground for every foot of altitude you lost. For a Super Hornet, that was around 210 knots. For a Boeing 777, it was different, but the principle was the same. Maya lowered the nose slightly, letting the aircraft accelerate to approximately 280 knots, the speed she calculated would give them the best glide performance. Kansas City Center, Transcontinental 2847, we have a dual-engine failure at flight level 370. We are declaring an emergency and diverting to Lambert International. We have 197 souls on board and approximately 2 hours of fuel remaining. Jason's voice was shaking as he transmitted. The controller's response came back immediately, all business. Transcontinental 2847, Roger, understand dual engine failure. Squawk 7700. You are cleared direct Lambert. Descend and maintain at your discretion. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Maya was already descending, but she was doing it carefully. Descending too fast would waste energy. Descending too slow would mean they might not reach the airport. She needed to descend at exactly the right rate, about 1,500 feet per minute, to maximize their glide distance. The aircraft was eerily quiet without the constant background roar of the engines. The only sounds were the wind whistling over the fuselage and the occasional beep from the instruments. Maya could feel the resistance in the controls. Without engine-driven hydraulics, the backup systems made the aircraft heavier to maneuver, but her years of physical training and flying heavy combat aircraft meant she had the strength to handle it. Jason, I need you to run the dual-engine failure checklist, but I'm going to be making some modifications to the standard procedure. Jason pulled out the emergency checklist, his hands still shaking. Captain, I've never actually done this outside the simulator. I know. Follow my lead. First, I need you to calculate our exact glide range based on our current altitude, weight, and winds. Use the performance data in the flight management computer. Jason worked the problem while Maya flew. Her eyes continuously scanned the instruments, airspeed, altitude, vertical speed, heading. She was flying the aircraft with a precision that came from thousands of carrier landings where being off by even 5 knots or 50 feet could mean disaster. Based on our current altitude of 35,000 feet, weight, and the winds aloft data, we should be able to glide approximately 95 miles in still air. But we've got a 15-knot headwind component, so that reduces our ground distance to maybe 85 miles. And we're 73 miles from Lambert. Yes, but... Captain, we're going to be borderline. If we hit any unexpected winds or have to maneuver. We'll make it, Maya said with absolute confidence. Trust me. What Jason didn't know, what nobody in the civilian aviation world would know unless they'd flown combat aircraft, was that Maya had once glided an F/A-18 with both engines out for 12 minutes and 47 miles before successfully relighting the engines at 8,000 feet. She'd had to manage every ounce of energy with perfection, and she'd done it. This was the same problem, just scaled up to a much larger aircraft. At 9:31 a.m., something unexpected happened. A new voice came over the radio, a military frequency that bled over onto the emergency channel. Civilian aircraft declaring emergency in our airspace. This is Cutlass flight of 2 F/A-18 Super Hornets out of the 131st Fighter Wing, Missouri Air National Guard. We have you on radar and are vectoring to provide assistance. What is your situation? Maya felt a strange mixture of emotions. She reached for the radio transmit button. Cutlass flight, this is Transcontinental 2847. We are a Boeing 777 with dual engine failure at 33,000 feet, gliding toward Lambert International. We have 197 souls on board and are managing the emergency. There was a brief pause, and then the F/A-18 pilot responded. His call sign was Cutlass 1, and his voice carried the clipped professionalism of a combat aviator. 2847, copy all. We're approximately 12 miles from your position, coming up on your 6 o'clock. We'll establish visual contact and provide escort. Advise if you need any assistance with communications or coordination. Cutlass flight, thank you. We're stable at this time, but any assistance is appreciated. Within 2 minutes, Maya could see them in her mirrors, 2 gray F/A-18 Super Hornets, beautiful and deadly, sliding into formation on either side of her powerless airliner. They matched her speed precisely, staying about 500 feet away, their pilots clearly skilled. Seeing those aircraft, the same type she'd flown for so many years, brought back a flood of memories. Maya had logged over 1,200 hours in the F/A-18, flying missions that ranged from routine training to combat operations. She'd landed on carrier decks in storms, she'd flown close air support missions, she'd trained with the best fighter pilots in the world. And now, here she was, flying a crippled civilian airliner while her former aircraft escorted her. 2847, Cutlass 1. We have visual on your aircraft. No visible damage, no fire, no smoke. Your flight profile looks very controlled. How are you managing your glide? Maya keyed the radio. Cutlass 1, we're at best glide speed, managing our energy to maximize range. Currently calculating we'll have about 8 to 10 miles of margin when we reach Lambert. There was a longer pause this time. Then, 2847, your energy management is impressive. Very precise. What's your background? Maya hesitated. She generally didn't talk about her military past. But right now, with her former aircraft flying escort and with 197 lives depending on her decisions, it seemed foolish to hide it. Cutlass 1, I'm former Navy. I flew Rhinos for 8 years. Rhinos was the nickname for the F/A-18 Super Hornet. The response was immediate and filled with new respect. 2847, Cutlass 1, copy that. Navy Super Hornet pilot. That explains the tactical flying. Ma'am, it's an honor to escort you. We've got your back. Jason was staring at Maya with wide eyes. You flew F divided by a -18s. Long time ago, Maya said, her eyes never leaving the instruments. Jason, I need you to contact Lambert Tower directly and tell them we'll need the longest runway available, all emergency equipment standing by, and the airport should be cleared of other traffic. We're going to make a straight-in approach with no go-around capability. Roger. Jason made the radio call while Maya continued her precisely controlled descent. They were now at 28,000 feet with 61 miles to go to Lambert. Maya's calculations showed they were right on profile, losing altitude at exactly the rate needed to arrive at the airport at approximately 2,500 feet, which would give her enough height to maneuver for landing. In the passenger cabin, people had started to realize something was wrong. The engine's absence was noticeable now, and the emergency lighting had activated. The head flight attendant, Carol Martinez, had received a call from Maya on the interphone. "Carol, we've experienced a dual-engine failure. We're diverting to St. Louis and will be landing in approximately 15 minutes. I need you to prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Review emergency procedures with your crew, make sure passengers are briefed, and prepare for possible evacuation on the runway." "But Carol, we're going to be fine. I need you to trust me on that. Keep everyone calm." Carol's voice was shaky but professional. "Yes, Captain. We'll prepare the cabin." Maya then made an announcement to the passengers. Her voice was remarkably calm, the same tone she'd used when briefing combat missions. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richardson. We've experienced a mechanical issue with both engines, and we're diverting to Lambert International Airport in St. Louis for a precautionary landing. We will be landing in approximately 15 minutes. I need you to remain calm and follow all instructions from the flight attendants. We are executing standard emergency procedures, and I am confident we will land safely. Please review the safety card in your seat pocket and prepare for an emergency landing." There was no panic in her voice, no fear, no uncertainty. And somehow, that calmness transmitted itself to the passengers. Yes, they were scared, who wouldn't be, but they trusted the voice of their captain. They didn't know she'd been in situations far more dangerous than this and had survived them all. At 9:39 a.m., they were at 18,000 feet with 38 miles to go. The F divided by a -18s were still flying formation, and Cutlass 1 had been coordinating with air traffic control to ensure the airspace ahead was completely clear. Maya was now beginning to plan the final approach. Landing a powerless aircraft was all about energy management. She needed to arrive at the runway with just enough altitude and speed to make the landing, but not so much that she'd overshoot. Too high and she'd float past the runway. Too low and she'd hit short. In an F/A-18, she'd practiced emergency approaches hundreds of times. The technique was called a flame-out approach, gliding the aircraft to a precise touchdown point using nothing but gravity and aerodynamics. It required perfection because there was no second chance, no go-around, no adding power to correct mistakes. "Jason, I need you to calculate our approach profile for runway 11 at Lambert. I want to cross the threshold at 500 feet and 180 knots. Calculate the glide path I need to maintain." Jason worked the problem on his computer. "Based on our current position, altitude, and that target, you'll need to maintain a glide slope of approximately 3.2 degrees from our initial approach point." "Good. Set up the instruments for that profile." They were now at 12,000 feet with 21 miles to go. Maya could see St. Louis in the distance, the gateway arch glinting in the morning sun, the Mississippi River winding through the city. Lambert International Airport was just beyond the city center. Cutlass 1 came back on the radio. 2847, your approach profile is looking perfect. You're right on the money for altitude and distance. Whoever taught you energy management knew what they were doing. I had good instructors, Maya replied simply. What she didn't say was that those instructors had been Navy carrier landing signal officers, the best in the world at teaching precision approaches. At 9:44 a.m., they were at 8,000 feet with 12 miles to go. Maya was beginning to configure the aircraft for landing. Without engine power, deploying flaps and landing gear would create drag and reduce their glide range, so she had to time it perfectly. Jason, I'm going to fly this approach a little differently than standard procedure. I'm going to keep the aircraft clean, no flaps, no gear, until we're absolutely certain we can make the runway. Then I'll configure all at once. Captain, the checklist says to configure early to ensure. I know what the checklist says. But I also know that if we configure too early and we're short on energy, we won't make the runway. Trust me. I've done this before. Jason nodded, though he looked worried. But he'd seen Maya's calm competence throughout this emergency, and something told him she knew exactly what she was doing. The F divided by a -18s were still flying escort, one on each wing. Maya could see the pilots clearly through her side windows. They were watching her aircraft intently, ready to relay any information about her approach profile or condition. At 9:47 a.m., they were at 4,500 feet with 6 miles to go. Maya had them lined up perfectly with runway 11. The airport was visible ahead, emergency vehicles were staged along the taxiways, and the entire airport had been cleared of other traffic. 2847, Lambert Tower, you are cleared to land runway 11. Wind calm. Emergency equipment is standing by. Good luck, Captain. Transcontinental 2847, cleared to land runway 11, Maya acknowledged. She was now committed. They were at 3,800 feet with 4 miles to go. Her calculations showed she'd cross the runway threshold at approximately 650 feet if she maintained her current profile, which meant she needed to lose about 150 feet to hit her target of 500 feet. She'd do that by extending the landing gear and flaps at exactly the right moment. Jason, on my call, gear down, flaps 30. Ready. At 3 miles out and 2,800 feet altitude, Maya made the call. Gear down, flaps 30. Jason's hands moved on the controls, and Maya felt the aircraft shudder as the landing gear extended into the airstream and the flaps deployed. The nose wanted to pitch down, and the sink rate increased dramatically. Maya countered with back pressure on the yoke, raising the nose just enough to maintain her glide path. The F divided by a -18s had peeled away now, giving her room to maneuver. Cutlass One's voice came over the radio one last time, 2847, you've got this. Beautiful flying. See you on the ground. Thanks, Cutlass. Appreciate the escort. Maya was now flying entirely manually, her hands and feet working the controls with the precision that only thousands of hours of flying could develop. She was at 1,200 feet, 2 miles from the runway, descending at 1,000 feet per minute. The airspeed was exactly 190 knots, a bit faster than normal but correct for a flaps 30, no power approach. At 1 mile out and 600 feet, she called for full flaps. Flaps full. Jason extended them, and the sink rate increased again. Maya compensated, adjusting her pitch attitude with tiny movements of the yoke. She was flying the aircraft with a delicacy that came from carrier landings where precision wasn't optional, it was survival. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. The runway numbers were coming up fast. Maya judged her flare perfectly, raising the nose just enough to cushion the touchdown without floating. The main landing gear touched the runway with a firm but controlled thump. Maya immediately lowered the nose wheel to the runway and reached for the speed brake lever, deploying it to maximum. Without engine reverse thrust, aerodynamic braking was all they had besides the wheel brakes. The Boeing 777 rolled down runway 11 at Lambert International, slowing steadily. The runway was 11,000 feet long, and they had plenty of space. At 60 knots, Maya applied the brakes fully, and the aircraft came to a complete stop approximately 7,000 feet down the runway. For a moment, there was complete silence in the cockpit except for the sounds of instruments cooling down and hydraulic systems depressurizing. Then Jason let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like an hour. Holy! Captain, you just... That was... Maya was already running through the shutdown checklist. We're not done yet. We need to get these passengers off safely. Contact ground and tell them we're stopped on the runway. I want stairs brought to all doors and passengers deplaned directly onto the taxiway. Do not attempt to taxi, I don't trust the hydraulic systems after that flight. Within minutes, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Airport fire crews were checking for any signs of fuel leaks or fire hazards, though none were evident. Passenger stairs were being positioned at the doors. Maya stood up from her seat, her legs slightly unsteady after the intense concentration of the last 25 minutes. She and Jason made their way back into the passenger cabin. The sight that greeted her was remarkable. Passengers were crying with relief, hugging each other, texting loved ones. When they saw Maya emerge from the cockpit, a spontaneous round of applause broke out. People were standing, clapping, some wiping away tears. One passenger, a middle-aged businessman, reached out to shake her hand. "Captain, I just want to say, I've never been so scared in my life, but your voice, your calmness, you saved all of us." Maya shook his hand, accepting thanks from dozens of passengers as she made her way through the cabin, checking to ensure everyone was okay. The flight attendants had performed flawlessly, keeping people calm and prepared. Now they were coordinating the evacuation, which was proceeding in an orderly fashion. Outside the aircraft, as passengers descended the stairs onto the taxiway, they were greeted by emergency personnel and airport staff. News helicopters were already circling overhead, word of the emergency landing had spread quickly. Maya was the last to leave the aircraft. As she descended the stairs, she was met by airport officials, airline management who had rushed to the scene, and, to her surprise, two figures in flight suits. The F/A-18 pilots from Cutlass Flight had landed at Lambert and driven out to meet her. The lead pilot, a man in his early 40s with the call sign, Hammer, stitched on his flight suit, extended his hand. "Captain Richardson. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Brad Hammond, Cutlass 1. This is Major Lisa Torres, Cutlass 2. Ma'am, that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. When you said you flew rhinos, you weren't kidding. That was a tactical flame-out approach that would have made any Navy LSO proud." Maya shook their hands, feeling a strange connection to these pilots who flew the aircraft she'd once flown. "Thank you, Colonel. Your escort and coordination made a huge difference." "Permission to speak frankly, ma'am?" Hammond asked. "Of course. When we first established contact, I figured we were dealing with a civilian pilot in serious trouble. But when you started managing that glide with that level of precision, when you started talking about energy management and tactical approaches, I knew we had someone special up there. Then when you told us you were Navy, flying rhinos. Ma'am, those passengers don't know how lucky they are. There's maybe a handful of pilots in the world who could have pulled off what you just did." Torres nodded in agreement. "The way you managed that approach, no engines, full manual control, that wasn't civilian flying. That was combat flying applied to a civilian emergency. You saved 197 lives today using skills that most commercial pilots don't have because they've never needed them." Maya felt uncomfortable with the praise. She'd just been doing what needed to be done, using the training she'd received years ago. "I just flew the aircraft. Same principles apply whether it's an F/A-18 or a 777. "Respectfully, ma'am, that's not true," Hammond said. "Most civilian pilots would have panicked or made critical mistakes in energy management. You flew that approach like you were setting up for a carrier trap with a flamed-out rhino. That's not something you learn in civilian flight school. That comes from hundreds of carrier landings and combat situations where perfection is the only acceptable standard." An airline official approached, Sarah Chen, the Transcontinental Airlines Vice President of Flight Operations, who had caught the first available flight to St. Louis when she'd heard about the emergency. "Captain Richardson, I need to speak with you about what happened up there." Maya excused herself from the military pilots and walked with Chen toward the terminal building. Behind them, passengers were being loaded onto buses to take them into the terminal. Emergency investigators were already beginning their examination of the aircraft. Inside a private conference room, Chen sat down across from Maya. "Captain, I've been reviewing the cockpit voice recorder data and the radar track of your flight. I've also been speaking with air traffic control and with those F/A-18 pilots. What you did today was extraordinary. You saved 197 passengers and crew through flying skills that I frankly didn't know any of our pilots possessed. Maya remained silent, unsure where this was going. Chen continued, I've been looking at your personnel file more carefully. It says you're former military, but it doesn't go into detail. It just says, U.S. Navy, pilot, honorable discharge. Would you mind explaining your background more fully? Maya took a breath. I spent 8 years in the Navy flying F/A-18 Super Hornets. I was carrier qualified, flew combat missions in 2 deployments, and was a flight instructor for my last 2 years of service. I left in 2017 and joined the airline in 2018. Chen's eyes widened. F divided by a -18s. Combat missions. Carrier qualified. Captain, why didn't you emphasize this in your hiring interviews? This is the kind of background that airlines value highly. Because I didn't think it mattered. I wanted to fly commercial aircraft, not trade on my military service. I figured my civilian flight time and certifications would speak for themselves. Well, today it mattered enormously. Captain, the way you managed that emergency, the precision of your flying, the calm decision-making, that wasn't standard commercial pilot training. That was combat aviation expertise applied to a civilian emergency. And it worked. Everyone survived because you had skills and experience that go far beyond what we normally see. Over the next several hours, Maya underwent detailed debriefings with airline officials, NTSB investigators, and FAA representatives. The cause of the dual-engine failure was still under investigation, but preliminary reports suggested it might have been contaminated fuel that caused both engines to fail within seconds of each other, an extraordinarily rare event. What became clear through all the debriefings was that Maya's handling of the emergency was exceptional. The investigators noted her precise energy management, her tactical approach to the landing, and her use of techniques that weren't in standard commercial pilot training but which had proven exactly right for the situation. One NTSB investigator, a former Air Force pilot himself, pulled Maya aside. Captain, I flew C-17s for 20 years, and I can tell you that what you did today is going to be taught as a case study. Your application of military aviation principles to a civilian emergency, your energy management, your approach profile, your decision-making, it was textbook combat flying adapted perfectly to a different aircraft type. Those passengers are alive because of skills you learned in the military that civilian training doesn't teach. By late afternoon, the story had spread across the news media. Miracle landing in St. Louis was the headline on every major news network. Video of the landing, captured by news helicopters and airport cameras, showed the powered Boeing 777 making a perfect touchdown and rollout with no engines running. But as reporters dug deeper into the story, they discovered something that made it even more compelling. The captain wasn't just any commercial pilot, she was a former F/A-18 combat pilot whose military training had proven essential to saving everyone on board. The headlines evolved: former combat pilot saves 197 in emergency landing, and Navy fighter pilot training saves passengers when commercial aircraft loses both engines. Maya's phone was flooded with messages. Her parents, who'd always been proud of her Navy service, were crying with relief and pride. Her former squadron mates from her Navy days were reaching out, congratulating her and joking that she'd always been the best stick-and-rudder pilot in the squadron. Current airline colleagues were expressing amazement. They'd flown with her for years and never realized she had such an extensive military background. That evening, Maya stood in her hotel room in St. Louis, watching the news coverage on TV. There was video of the landing, interviews with passengers who were praising her, and analysis from aviation experts discussing the technical aspects of what she'd done. One expert, a retired airline captain, was explaining to the news anchor, what Captain Richardson did today was use advanced military aviation techniques that most commercial pilots simply don't have in their toolkit. Energy management in a powerless aircraft, tactical approach planning, carrier-style precision landing, these are skills that Navy fighter pilots develop through years of intensive training and operational experience. She essentially flew a flame-out approach in a commercial aircraft the same way she would have in an F/A-18, and it worked perfectly. There was a knock at her door. Maya opened it to find Lieutenant Colonel Hammond and Major Torres in civilian clothes. "Captain Richardson, sorry to bother you," Hammond said. "We're heading back to base, but we wanted to check in on you before we left. How are you holding up?" Maya invited them in. "Honestly, I'm not sure. This whole day feels surreal." Torres smiled. "I bet. But Captain Maya, if I may, you should be incredibly proud of what you did today. You used your military training to save civilian lives. That's the kind of thing that makes our service meaningful." Hammond nodded. "I've been thinking about what you did today, and I wanted to share something. In the military, we train for situations like this constantly. Engine failures, emergencies, things going wrong, we practice them over and over until they become second nature. But most commercial pilots never experience these situations in real life. They practice in simulators, but it's not the same. You had the real experience, and when it mattered most, that experience saved 197 people." "I just did what I was trained to do," Maya said. "Exactly," Hammond replied. "But that training, the combat flying, the carrier operations, the emergency procedures, that's not something you get from civilian flight school. You earned that through years of service, and today it paid dividends in a way you probably never expected." Maya nodded slowly. It was strange to think that skills she'd learned years ago, in a completely different context, had proven so essential today. When she'd left the Navy and joined the airline, she'd thought she was leaving that world behind. But today had shown her that you never really leave it behind. The training becomes part of you, shapes how you think and react, and stays with you forever. The next morning, January 16th, Maya met with the 197 passengers from Flight 2847 at a gathering organized by the airline. Many of them wanted to thank her personally. There were emotional moments as people recounted their fear during the emergency and their gratitude for her calm leadership. One young mother with 2 small children approached Maya with tears in her eyes. "Captain, I don't know how to thank you. When we lost the engines, I thought my children would grow up without their mother. But you saved us. Your voice on the intercom was so calm, so confident. I believed you when you said we'd be okay, and you were right." An elderly man, a retired airline pilot himself, shook Maya's hand firmly. "Captain, I flew for 35 years, and I want you to know that what you did yesterday was the finest piece of aviating I've ever witnessed. The way you managed that powerless glide, the precision of your approach, that was artistry. You should be very proud." But perhaps the most moving moment came when a young girl, about 10 years old, approached shyly. "Captain Maya, I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up. You're a hero." Maya knelt down to the girl's level. "You know what? You can be a pilot. You can be anything you want to be. But here's what I want you to remember, being a pilot isn't about being a hero. It's about training hard, learning everything you can, and being prepared for whatever challenges come your way. Yesterday, I just used the training I received years ago. That's all any pilot does." The girl smiled and hugged Maya, and in that moment, Maya felt something shift inside her. For 6 years, she'd kept her military background quiet, treating it as something from her past that wasn't relevant to her current life. But maybe it was relevant. Maybe her journey from combat pilot to commercial pilot, and the way those 2 worlds had intersected yesterday, was something worth sharing and being proud of. Over the following weeks, the investigation into the dual-engine failure continued. It was eventually determined that the fuel loaded in Denver had been contaminated with a substance that caused both engines to fail within seconds of each other. It was an extraordinarily rare occurrence, a 1-in-a-million event that had required an extraordinary pilot to overcome. The NTSB issued its preliminary report praising Maya's handling of the emergency. The report specifically noted that her military aviation background and combat flying experience had been crucial factors in the successful outcome. The report stated, "Captain Richardson's application of military energy management techniques, tactical approach procedures, and combat-proven decision-making skills to a civilian emergency situation represents the highest standard of piloting and airmanship. Her training as a Navy F/A-18 pilot provided capabilities that standard commercial pilot training does not develop, and these capabilities proved essential to saving 197 lives. The Navy reached out to Maya, asking if she'd be willing to speak at the Naval Aviation School in Pensacola about how military training translates to civilian flying and how the skills learned in combat aviation can apply to non-military situations. She agreed, and in March 2024, she found herself back at the base where she'd learned to fly F/A-18S 15 years earlier. Standing in front of a classroom of young naval aviators in training, Maya shared her story. She talked about her years flying Super Hornets, the challenges of carrier operations, the combat missions that had tested her skills, and then her transition to commercial aviation. She explained how she'd thought the two worlds were separate, but how January 15 had shown her they were connected in ways she hadn't expected. The skills you're learning here, the precision flying, the emergency procedures, the tactical thinking, you might think these only apply to military aviation, she told the young pilots. But what I learned is that these skills are universal. They make you a better pilot regardless of what you're flying. The carrier landing precision that you'll develop here. I used that to land a powerless Boeing 777. The energy management you learn in tactical flying. I used that to glide 73 miles with no engines. The calm decision-making you develop in combat situations. I used that to keep 197 passengers and crew safe during a catastrophic emergency. One young naval aviator raised his hand. Captain Richardson, did you ever imagine when you were learning to fly Super Hornets that you'd use those skills to save commercial passengers someday? Maya smiled. Never. When I was learning to fly F/A-18S, I was focused on becoming a good combat pilot. I wasn't thinking about how those skills might transfer to other types of flying. But that's the thing about good training, it prepares you for situations you can't even imagine. The Navy taught me to be a skilled, tactical, precise pilot, and those qualities stayed with me even after I left active duty. The speech received a standing ovation from the young naval aviators, and afterward, several of them approached Maya to ask more detailed questions about the emergency and how she'd applied specific F/A-18 techniques to flying the Boeing 777. Back in the civilian world, Maya returned to flying for transcontinental airlines. But things were different now. Her colleagues treated her with a new respect, not just as a competent captain but as someone with extraordinary skills and experience. First officers competed to fly with her, hoping to learn from her tactical approach to aviation. The airline, recognizing the value of Maya's background, asked her to develop a new training program incorporating military aviation techniques into commercial pilot training. She worked with the airline's training department to create modules on advanced energy management, tactical decision-making, and precision flying that drew from military aviation principles. But perhaps more importantly, Maya had changed. She no longer hid her military background or treated it as irrelevant to her current career. She realized that her 8 years flying F/A-18S had shaped her into the pilot she was, and that was something to be proud of. She started mentoring young pilots, especially women interested in military aviation, sharing her journey and encouraging them to pursue their dreams. One afternoon in May 2024, Maya was in the cockpit preparing for another flight, this time a routine run from Boston to Los Angeles, when her first officer, a young woman named Jennifer Park, asked her a question. "Captain, I've been thinking about joining the military reserves to get more advanced flying experience. Do you think it's worth it?" Maya looked at Jennifer and smiled. "For months ago, I would have told you that military flying and commercial flying are separate worlds, and that military training isn't necessary for airline work. But now I'd tell you that military aviation training will make you a better pilot in ways you can't even imagine. It'll teach you precision, discipline, tactical thinking, and emergency skills that you might never use in commercial flying, or you might use them one day to save 197 lives. You never know when the training will matter, but when it does, you'll be glad you have it." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. I think I'm going to do it. Your story inspired me. As Maya taxied the aircraft toward the runway for takeoff, she reflected on how far she'd come since that January morning. She'd gone from being a quiet commercial pilot who never talked about her past to someone who openly shared her military background and used it to inspire and teach others. The dual-engine failure on Flight 2847 had been terrifying, dangerous, and could have ended in tragedy. But instead, it had ended with everyone safe because one pilot had training that went beyond the ordinary. It had shown that military aviation skills, developed through years of rigorous training in combat operations, could save civilian lives when the unthinkable happened. As she advanced the throttles for takeoff, Maya thought about the F divided by a -18 as she'd flown years ago, the carrier decks she'd landed on, the combat missions she'd flown. She thought about how all of that had led to this moment, to this career, to the ability to safely transport hundreds of passengers across the country every day. And she thought about January 15, 2024, the day her two worlds had collided, the day her past had saved her present, the day she'd learned that you never stop being the pilot you were trained to be, no matter how much time passes or how much your career changes. The Boeing 777 lifted off smoothly into the afternoon sky, climbing toward cruising altitude. The flight would be routine, uneventful, exactly as it should be. But Maya knew now that she was ready for anything, because somewhere deep inside her, she would always be a fighter pilot, always be a tactical aviator, always be prepared to use every skill she'd ever learned to keep her passengers safe. That was the legacy of her F/18 years. Not just the flying skills or the technical knowledge, but the mindset, the refusal to panic, the commitment to precision, the determination to bring everyone home safely no matter what challenges arose. Those qualities had been forged in the skies over aircraft carriers and in combat zones around the world, and they'd proven just as valuable in civilian aviation when the unthinkable happened. Maya Richardson had learned something important on January 15. You can leave military aviation, but military aviation never leaves you. It becomes part of who you are, shapes how you think and act, and stays with you throughout your career. And sometimes, when fate demands it, those military skills become the difference between tragedy and triumph, between disaster and miracle, between loss and the safe return of 197 souls who trusted their captain to bring them home. She had brought them home. And she'd done it using skills that many people didn't even know she possessed, the skills of a combat pilot, a tactical aviator, a warrior who'd fought in the skies and survived to fly another day. Now, as she flew this routine commercial flight, Maya carried that knowledge with pride. She was Captain Maya Richardson, commercial airline pilot. But she was also, and would always be, a naval aviator who'd flown F/18 Super Hornets in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Both identities were part of her. Both had value. And on January 15, 2024, both had come together to save 197 lives through the perfect application of combat aviation expertise to a civilian emergency. That was her story. That was her legacy. And she was finally at peace with all of it.